It's great to hear all the commotions going on, especially the opportunity to socialize and everything with everybody, but we got a full plate ahead of us and we need to get started. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Tri-City Regional Chamber Network's Membership Luncheon. I'm Mike McWhorter, Chair of the Board Chair of the Tri-City Regional Chamber of Commerce. Lori Madsen, who's usually here and doing this, is gone this week on vacation and actually celebrating her birthday. I won't tell which one, but so she's celebrating her birthday. So those that would like, please send her an email, text, whatever you want to send her to wish her happy birthday. Thank you for joining us for the annual Congressional Update Luncheon featuring Congressman Doc Hastings. Doc, we'd like to look forward to seeing you and hearing from you each year and appreciate you taking the time during your busy schedule to make this an annual event for us. Thank you very much. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce today's keynote speaker, Congressman Doc Hastings. Doc Hastings first joined the U.S. House of Representatives in 1995 to serve Washington's 4th Congressional District. He brought with him solid legislative experience and a strong work ethic, coupled with the desire to bring the common, sensitive, traditional values of Central Washington back to Washington, D.C. After graduating from Pasco High, go Bulldogs, Doc studied business administration at Columbia Basin College and at Central Washington University. Later, while running his family business, Columbia Basin Paper Supply, Doc established himself as a leader in the local business community. Before serving in Congress, Doc served 8 years in Washington State Legislature. As a Washington State Legislator. During the time in the House of Representatives, Doc established a long record of serving the people, the communities, and the priorities of Central Washington. Doc founded the bipartisan Congressional Nuclear Cleanup Caucus to promote cleanup of nuclear waste sites like Hanford. Since then, he has earned a reputation as an effective leader on nuclear cleanup issues. Each year, Doc works to ensure that Hanford's cleanup progress is accomplished as safely, quickly, and efficiently as possible. At the start of the 112th Congress, Doc was selected by his colleagues to serve as the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. The committee has a major role in producing more American-made energy, with control over hydro and oil and gas reserves on public lands and waters. Under Doc's leadership, the community is dedicated to pursuing policies that both strengthen our economy and protect our nation's treasured lands, oceans, and wildlife. Please help me welcome Representative Doc Hastings.
Thank you very much. It is always a pleasure for me to address the Tri-City Regional Chamber, and it's always in August, and I'm always amazed, frankly, at the turnout. To coin a phrase, hot August nights is not conducive to people coming out to listen to a politician speak at a luncheon, but thank you all very much for being here. I want to touch on a couple of subjects here today, and towards the end I want to give what I think probably may be critical prognostications of how I see things going forward in our federal government. And it's just kind of a warning or a heads up that we all need to be aware of. But first, let me talk about, I think, some very positive things that are going on. We all know that the Hanford Nuclear Reservation is a big part of our economy, and we all know how Hanford started because of events of the Second World War. Were it not for the Second World War, who knows what that part of Benton County would be, but it would more likely be very heavily agriculture. But because of the Second World War, and because this was an isolated area at that time, and because we had the Columbia River with a lot of water, and because Grand Coulee Dam was up and operating, it was a perfect site to develop weapons to defeat our enemies during the Second World War. Because the thought was, at that time, that Nazi Germany was ahead of us in atomic weaponry, and they were ahead of us in developing jet propulsion for an Air Force. These are two critical things. Had they come together, who knows what the Second World War would have been about. But the Manhattan Project was picked here to develop one of the weapons to end the Second World War. And we know from our history here that the fuel for the second bomb over Nagasaki was produced right here at Hanford, and shortly after that, the Second World War ended. And then Hanford got into defense production for some 40 years, building up our strong defenses, nuclear weaponry and so forth. And largely because of that effort, we won the Cold War. But because of that effort out here at Hanford, there is a legacy that needs to be taken care of, and that's the cleanup, and Mike alluded to that, of cleaning up these nuclear sites. And I guess the big part of that is the underground tanks at Hanford. And they store 53 million gallons. I've heard 53, 55. Somebody can correct me, but it's between 53 and 55, okay, million gallons. How many people here have been to Washington, D.C. and been in the U.S. House chamber? Okay, you have a pretty good idea of how large that House chamber is. If you were to put all of that 53 million gallons into one area, just to put things into perspective, it would fill up over 21 House chambers. That's how much of hazardous / nuclear waste is stored in the underground tanks, and that's why the cleanup effort has to go on. And so the area of focus for that is the Office of River Protection. There's two offices out at Hanford, the Office of River Protection and Richland Operations. The Office of River Protection generally is that part that's cleaning up the tanks to send the waste to Yucca Mountain. Now, I've been critical of the Department of Energy because they haven't had a plan for it. Now, in fairness, when you're building a facility like the waste treatment plant and you're doing the engineering studies as you're building it, there's bound to be some glitches along the way, and there has been. But we need to know in Congress what the plan forward is from the Department of Energy so we can plan and educate our colleagues as to the need to make sure that the funding goes forward so that can be cleaned up. Now, I've spoken with new Secretary of Energy, Muniz, several times. He tells me a plan is forthcoming. Senator Murray and I have both expressed to him that we need to have that plan so we can move forward. I hope that plan does come sooner rather than later. And I might say, Secretary Muniz does have a lot of knowledge about what's going on out there as far as nuclear, and I look forward very much to working with him. So that's kind of the overall picture of where Hanford is. Here's the good part. When the Manhattan Project was formed, the rush to get things done out there was very, very quick, and one of the first reactors, in fact, the first operating reactor was the B reactor. Now, 3 of the sites that were originally part of the Manhattan Project, Hanford, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and in New Mexico, they were the 3 major parts of the Manhattan Project. I have introduced legislation that has passed out of the House to make the B reactor and the Manhattan Project and these other 3 sites part of a national park system. That bill has passed the House. It is waiting action in the Senate. A corresponding Senate bill is passed out of committee. Now, I think that is very, very important in the future because the legacy of what was done by these pioneers, and last Saturday, by the way, we celebrated Colonel Franklin Matthias, who was the colonel in charge of the Manhattan Project here. It was quite a ceremony that was put on there. But I think that needs to be commemorated. The best way to do that, I think, is to make that part of our national park system because of what those people did in such a short period of time in order to win. So that bill has passed like I say, has passed the House, waiting action in the Senate, and I'm very confident that we can get that done hopefully by the end of this year. Now, in conjunction with that, during the defense production, our tallest mountain around here, Rattlesnake Mountain, was off limits for all the right reasons. I mean, for goodness sakes, if you're in defense production, you don't want to give anybody access to a higher higher elevation so you can see what's going on. So Rattlesnake Mountain was off limits to everybody. But we're no longer in defense production. And yet everybody can see Rattlesnake Mountain. I believe there ought to be access to the top of Rattlesnake Mountain in some ways, and people can go up there and see that view. And those of you that have the privilege of going to the top of Rattlesnake Mountain and seeing the panoramic sight is truly something. And as our economy here diversifies, and it is going to diversify when, as Hanford changes over time, with tourism and now the growing wine industry that we have here in Central Washington. If you add something like access to the top of Rattlesnake Mountain, I just think it enhances what we have to offer here in this area. So that bill too has passed out of the House, waiting action in the Senate, and I'm hopeful again that we can pass those bills. So those are two things that I think that that will enhance our economy as we move forward in the future. Now, as Mike mentioned, I have the privilege of chairing the U.S. House Natural Resources Committee. It's a committee that has broad jurisdiction over virtually all federal lands, but it also has jurisdiction over the Bureau of Reclamation. Obviously, the Columbia Basin Project and the Yakima Project is under that jurisdiction. That's what's created our very vibrant agriculture industry. We have jurisdiction over all the power marketing authorities, of which the Bonneville Power Administration is the largest of the PMAs in the country. So it really does fit, I think, the area that I have the privilege to represent with what we are, with the responsibilities of that committee. But there's two areas that in the last 3.5 years, or 2.5 years, I should say, that we have focused on, and I think while they may be parochial in nature to other parts of the country, they are very important, I think, to the long-term economic growth of our country and the security of our country. And the two things I want to talk about is energy production, and the other is managing our national forests. Let me first talk about energy production. The greatest potential of energy production in the United States right now lies on federal lands, whether you're talking about offshore lands in the Outer Continental Shelf or off the Pacific or the Atlantic coast, or onshore, principally in the Intermountain West. And why that's important is because up until 2 years ago, we were importing most of our energy, crude oil primarily, from overseas, and primarily from countries that are in many cases antagonistic to us. Think of Iran and think of the Middle East. But with the new technologies and exploration of oil and natural gas, and this has been happening, by the way, on private and state lands, principally in North Dakota. Right now, we are not now importing most of our crude oil. We are developing that here because of those new technologies. So when you look at the world today, when you look at what's going on in Syria, when you look at what's going on in Egypt with the access to the Red Sea and our dependence on foreign oil, and by the way, crude oil is always going to be a worldwide commodity. It's always going to be subject to worldwide prices. Why should we not, in the United States, when we have these tremendous reserves, why should we not utilize those reserves to our benefit? Energy jobs are good paying jobs. And a growing economy is going to have a reliable source of energy. When I say reliable, think back, for those of us who remember the oil embargo, or the problems we had in the 70s where we had gas lines and you could only gas up every other day. Why should we get in that situation when we have the potential right here? So that's what we have been focusing on, that in my committee, and we have passed several bills out of the House, and I might add, on a bipartisan basis. Of course, when things pass out of the House on a bipartisan basis, it hardly gains any news because everybody wants to talk about the partisanship. But these bills have passed out on a bipartisan basis, and they're weighing action in the Senate. And we have similarly, and by the way, what we say in these bills is really pretty straightforward. We say that we should offer, I'll talk about offshore, we say that we should offer potential leases to where we know the potential resources are. What a novel idea. Offer leases where you think you can get oil or some product. That's not being done now, I might add. Now, similarly, onshore, exactly the same way. There's a whole amount of government lands under the Bureau of Land Management. And the bills that we pass direct them to offer leases where the greatest resources are. Again, what a novel idea. But it's not happening right now, and that has passed, again, out of the House, waiting action in the Senate. So I think in the long run, as whatever happens in the Middle East, and I certainly have no crystal ball, all I know that it's very volatile over there. And if our big source of our energy is in that part of the world, it's in our best interest, it seems to me, to become less dependent on those sources, especially when we have the resources here and the technology to develop those resources. So we have spent a great deal of time in my committee on that. Now, every year there's forest fires that go on. In fact, we read about it. There's a terrible fire down in California as we speak right now. We've had several forest fires here in Washington State. And part of those reasons, not exclusively, but part of the reasons is because our federal forests have not been managed properly. Now, what does managed properly mean? I am a very strong believer that all federal lands, especially lands under my jurisdiction, unless otherwise designated by Congress, were designed to be used for multiple use. And multiple use includes commercial activity, recreational activity, unless Congress otherwise states so, like in wilderness or what have you. But unfortunately, it's been going on for some generations, there has been a de facto effort to kind of close up all of our federal lands. And as a result, our federal forests have not been managed properly. Case in point, since 1980, nationwide, timber harvests on federal lands have declined by 80%. In Washington, Oregon, and California, it's declined by 90%, principally because of the spotted owl listing and old growth timber. That's not exclusively it, but that's a big part of it. So nationwide, let's just take that figure of 80% reduction in timber harvests in the national forest lands. If you graph that and then graph correspondingly the incidence of forest fires, they cross. Timber harvest goes down, forest fires going up, and we're seeing it right now because they're not managed. In Colorado, principally, for example, they've had a terrible infestation of insects that has destroyed a lot of their forests. Now, put in your mind that timber is a crop like any other crop, except you harvest it in a 30 to 40 year time period, whereas you harvest wheat every year. But if you picture timber as something that's harvested every 30 to 40 years, and you have an infestation of some insect that's going to destroy your crop, obviously the best way to try to do that is to spray the crop. We do that with potatoes, we do that with wheat, we do that with virtually every crop that we grow right here on a one-year basis. But because of regulations and environmental laws and lawsuits, they have not sprayed those trees principally in Colorado. As a result, they die. Whatever commercial activity they would have diminishes because dead trees don't have commercial activity or have commercial value, and that fuel builds up and then lightning strikes and stuff burns. Now that is what has happened because we haven't managed our forest lands over time. Back in 1980, in that time period, for every dollar that was spent by the federal government on forest health, we got $2 in return. Not a bad return coming from our assets. Right now, it is just the opposite. For every dollar that we get, we spend $2. And just last year alone, federally, on the federal level, we harvested 200 million acres of timber. 200 million acres of timber. Last year, 9.3 million acres burned. That's a ratio of 44 to 1, roughly. That is hardly managing one of our greatest assets, our national forests. So in that regard, we passed out of committee just before this August district work period a Healthy Forests Act that would direct Department of Interior, the Forest Service, to set goals on how much timber harvest there is going to be. It passed out of the committee on a voice vote. That means a bipartisan vote. Once again, there wasn't a great deal of publicity because it passed out on a bipartisan vote. We hope to have that bill on the floor in the House by hopefully next month, and then obviously the Senate has to act on it too. But I think it makes perfectly good sense because, again, timber jobs are very, very good paying jobs. And we've seen a decline in mills throughout this country. And if we can have a forest policy that encourages commercial activity, we will be, I think, better served in the long run. Also under my jurisdiction is the Endangered Species Act. Now, the Endangered Species Act was enacted in the early 70s, and principally from an emotional standpoint to save the not spotted owl, but the bald eagle, because the bald eagle was declining. Nobody wants to see any species knowingly go extinct, although that's happened in the history of the world. It happens on a regular basis. But nobody wants to see a species knowingly go extinct, hence the Endangered Species Act was put in place. The last time that it was reauthorized, was in 1988, 25 years ago. Yet we are still enforcing the law, and we have had a series of hearings in my committee, and I have formed a working group of members of Congress from all over the country. We have members from Texas, we have members from South Carolina and Florida and Maryland on this working group. Because what we have found in our hearings is that the implementation of the Endangered Species Act has not really saved any species because there's really no recovery aspect. That should be the first goal, is recovering species. Rather, it's become a litigant's dream. Little sop to you lawyers out here in the audience, but it's become a litigant's dream. But species aren't being saved. And a good case in point was a huge, what I call mega settlement that was made by this administration 2 years ago in 2011, where there was upwards of 700 species of animals and plants that were listed. Animals and plants. Now, one of them happened to be just north of where I live in Franklin County, called the bladder pod. This was a mega listing. And nobody here, including our elected officials on the county level, were contacted about that potential listing. And so what happened, they had a couple of hearings here in the Tri-Cities, and to the credit of those that were involved in that hearing, I know it was principally from the ag community, but there are others that were involved, asked if they could take the DNA of this bladder pod with bladder pods in other parts of the state and in other states. And they took the tests and sent it to University of Idaho, where a geneticist looked at it and found that the DNA was exactly the same in these other areas of the state, of our state, in 3 other different states. And yet the Department of Fish and Wildlife was bound, in fact they haven't made a decision yet, to list this when they have, when obviously the obvious scientific answer, at least from my point of view, suggested that it shouldn't even been listed in the first place. Now that caused a lot of heartburn, obviously, to the landowners up north because the bladder pod list rests on some private land. So that's another. We'll see what happens. We had a hearing, as a matter of fact, Commissioner Peck, who's in the audience here, came to that hearing. Kent McMullen testified. He was one of the farmers that was involved in this in front of our committee, and laid out what we had already heard before, that there simply is not due diligence to the listings of species in our country, and it has a I think a potential detrimental effect to our economy. Spotted owl comes to mind when I talk about 90% reduction because of spotted owl. And by the way, just as an aside, the scientific evidence now says it is not the lack of old growth that has caused the demise of the spotted owl, but rather a predator called the barred owl. So what is Fish and Wildlife's solution? Shoot the barred owl. Now, I'm just saying that I believe that there has to be some common sense in this, and the common sense means that the Endangered Species Act has to be rewritten and reauthorized to recover species. There's been over 2,000, giving you an example, there's been over 2,000 listings of species in the last, say, 20 years. And the recovery rate is so bad that if you equated that to batting averages, I mean, you barely make the, you don't last in the major leagues if you're at 250 very long. you wouldn't even make T-ball with the batting average, I think, with recovery. So we have jurisdiction under that, and I know that the local officials know what I'm talking about with the lack of transparency as to these listings. But it's costing money, and it has a detrimental effect because of the uncertainty of those people that are potentially affected. So we are going to work on the Endangered Species Act as we move forward, and hopefully we can have something to pinpoint to come up with some recommendations. And lastly, let me talk about an issue that we get a lot of correspondence with in our office back in D.C. and in my office in Yakima and here in Pasco, mainly asking questions but expressing concerns. And what it is, of course, is Obamacare. Now, full disclosure, I am not a fan of Obamacare. I voted no on Obamacare. I argued against Obamacare. I have voted 2 times to repeal Obamacare in totality, and I have voted upwards of 40 times to repeal parts of Obamacare. So now that you know where I'm coming from, I am not a fan of Obamacare. But I also believe and strongly believe that we are a government of laws. In fact, that is what has made America unique, is the mere fact that we are a government of laws. People don't rule us. It is a government of the people, and I appreciate that more since I've had the privilege of representing you in Washington, D.C. So we're a government of laws. In 2012, America had a choice. And that choice was 2 presidential candidates. One said he would sign a bill to repeal Obamacare. The other, obviously, is the author. Americans made their choice. They elected the guy that authored the bill. It's the law. Now, I'm going to do everything I can in the future to see that it is never fully implemented, but it is a law. So that's where we are. Now, what is disturbing, however, to me, is I see how this implementation is taking place. And every day, there is a new story about some glitch that goes on. The Congressional Research Service earlier this year said up to that time there was 82 benchmarks that they had to hit according to Obamacare. They missed half of them, 41 of them. And we're already seeing a reaction in the private sector. United Parcel Service just recently, last week, said that in their plans, they're not going to offer spousal coverage. But it's not exclusively to private companies. University of Virginia at Charlottesville said that they're not going to offer spousal coverage. We have seen reports that where premiums are offered, they're going up to some 200%. We don't know. I mean, these are all floating figures around. And I know people in the health industry, provider industry, are probably scratching their heads wondering what's coming down next. And there's also, this is just most recently, but it was predictable. I know I talked about it prior to Obamacare coming into law. It was how decisions are made as it relates to employment. If you're at the threshold of getting close to 50 employees, you have a very hard decision to make. Because you go over in 50 employees, you are totally involved in Obamacare, and if you're under, then you have some flexibility. Now, shouldn't decisions as far as economic growth be based on whatever product or service you're selling rather than on a regulation? Yet this is what is happening out in the marketplace. We're seeing it more and more. And the other aspect of that is, what is the definition of full time? 40 hours or 30 hours? 30 hours happens to be the threshold. So there's going to be a lot of businesses that'll have to make an economic decision when they hire somebody. All right, are they going to be 30 hours or 29 hours or 40 hours, and the ensuing cost comes with that? These are all questions that are unanswered right now, and I know that probably all of you that are in business are looking at this and say, okay, how does this fit where I am? And by the way, the exchanges are set up, and in Washington State the exchanges are set up. In my latest understanding, latest information I have, there's only 3 carriers. Now, the idea to bring down healthcare costs is to obviously bring in more, carriers so you can have that competition. Now, that's the latest. If I'm wrong, we can update that. But this is getting closer and closer all the time to being implemented. But we're seeing these sort of issues come up. Now, what I find somewhat disturbing is a pattern that has taken place with Obamacare, but it also took place as it relates to Yucca Mountain just 2 weeks ago. If you recall, several of our local members here, Gary Peterson is sitting here, I don't see Bill Lamson, but Gary was part of a lawsuit to say essentially that Yucca Mountain is by law the national repository, and he was joined by others, and the court ruled that yes, Yucca Mountain by law is a repository, even though politically some people don't like it. But if we're a government of laws, you have to follow the law. Now, Senator Reid, I'll point out his name, and virtually most politicians from Nevada don't like Yucca Mountain. Okay, that's fine. Maybe if I lived down there, I'd have a different view. But since our waste has to go to repository, I have a different view to my Nevada colleagues. But the law says Nevada. And yet, because of the influence that Senator Reid had, he apparently convinced this administration to not follow the law. And the lawsuit said, I'm sorry, NRC, you have to follow the law. Now, that to me is pretty significant. Getting back to Obamacare, when I heard that on July 3rd, which I think was a Friday, that this administration was suspending the employer mandate for Obamacare, and frankly, I didn't want to see anybody get into that sooner rather than later. But my first thought was, under what authority does the administration have to suspend a law? When you write laws, there are two huge, huge words. One is may, and the other is shall. May gives you flexibility, shall says you will do it. In Obamacare, it says these employer mandates shall be done. Now, by what authority does this administration have to waive that? And if they can waive that, what about all of these other things that are causing heartburn to people? And this is a disturbing trend that I see going on. And I would say this, by the way, under any administration. And that is that we are a government of laws and we divide power. But when one branch of the government starts to exert more power and say certain things like, well, if the Congress isn't going to do it, then I'm going to do it myself, that's not the way our system works. You have to have a lively debate and pass legislation to govern ourselves. But if we see these trends of suspending laws because they don't fit whatever the political landscape is at that moment, that's disturbing in the future. And I see this happening, and we're seeing this play out in our hands. I'm not going to make any predictions about potential waivers in Obamacare. Only this. In potential waivers, I believe that those waivers will be more friendly to a certain political thought than otherwise. That, to me, is disturbing. So, with that, we'll go back into session right after Labor Day. We do have some challenges as it relates to funding the government for the next year. We're in a system now where there's 12 appropriation bills that make up the federal spending, and the House has passed, I think, 7 of them as of this date. Fiscal year ends September 30th. The Senate has yet to pass 1 appropriation bill. So that means that we will probably get into what we call a continuing resolutions. Continuing resolutions is a terrible way, I think, to fund the government because there's no certainty for the departments or the contractors as to what the direction or how much money is coming. But I fear that we're getting into that CR aspect again. And then, of course, we have the debt limit coming. I'm a firm believer that we ought to pay, we need to pay our debts. And the position that we have taken in the House is that if we're going to raise the debt limit, and I think that we're going to have to pay our debts, no question about it, we need to somehow reduce spending. And a good ratio is if you raise the debt ceiling by, you pick a figure, then let's correspondingly cut spending by that same amount. Because if we don't get a handle in the long run on spending, we are cheating our kids and our grandkids especially. And for any of you that are here, say under 35 years of age, do you really believe in its current form Social Security or Medicare will be there for you? Everybody that age that I know, and I have 3 kids in that age group, they all say no. So we have to get a handle on this, and this may be an opportunity, and in the past, by the way, major bipartisan decisions have happened around a debt ceiling coming into play, and that will probably come into play sometime in October, at least by the latest news. So we have some challenges ahead of us, but I do want to say this. We are a country that is very, very unique in the world. When George Washington was elected president in 1789, he was the first elected leader in the world. Now, they had elected parliaments before, but nobody had elected a leader. A little over 224 years is a small, small time in mankind's history. And yet the rest of the world is emerging that way. We have to work constantly to make sure that that principle is still part of our governing power. Benjamin Franklin, when he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, was asked something to the extent of, what have you wrought, I think is the word they used. That was an old word from that time. And he said, a republic if we can keep it. And the operative word is if we can keep it. Because if we're the government of the people, the government have to be involved. So I'm just relating to you, after you've given me the pleasure and the privilege to represent you in Washington, D.C., I'm giving you my assessment as I see it right now on some of these issues. So with that, once again, Mike in Tri-City Chamber, thank you very, very much for having me. And if we have time for questions, I'll be more. How much time do we have? Five questions or 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a couple questions. Number one, are we going to get a farm bill? What kind of pressure could we apply to separate the farm bill from the nutrition program?
First question, just a little bit of history. The Farm Bill 40 years ago was put together with nutrition programs to form a coalition to pass the legislation. I suspect that at that time I wasn't in Congress, but it was probably a 50-50 proposition. Right now, the Farm Bill is misnamed because 80% of the funds is not farm related. The dispute on passing a farm bill is not related on farm. I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory within the farm prospect, but I don't think there's any showstoppers there that can't be negotiated out. The issue is the nutrition program, principally food stamp. So the Senate passed their bill with a nutrition program in. The House passed only a farm provision. That's all we've passed. The Senate now refuses to go to conference to work out the differences until we pass a nutrition program, and so our expectations are to pass a nutrition program sometime in September. Then we'll go to conference and hopefully we can work this out. But but understand the disagreements on the farm bill is not farm related. It's on nutrition programs. Yes, sir. Way in back.
How does Congressman, your standing, view the party as people in the party right now are leaning towards the young, aggressive crowd like Marco Rubio, Cruz, the fighters who really want change, as opposed to the old guard?
Well,
I don't have much option.
Well, let me try to broadly answer that by saying that there's no question that the country at large is divided philosophically. I don't think there's any question about that. And both political parties have factions within their parties that you don't see eye to eye. But I will say this, and I firmly believe it. The differences, if taken the Republican Party, the differences between our party is largely a matter of degree and process on how you're going to accomplish an end. I have a great deal of respect for Senator Rubio and Senator Cruz and Senator Paul and those colleagues that I have an opportunity to serve with. Were it not for that unrest, principally in 2010, principally against Obamacare, the Republicans would not have gained majority again in the U.S. House. Now, we have a system of government that is, it was supposed to be hard to govern. And our founders made it so. First of all, they divided powers with 3 branches, and we all know that from our civics. Now, in the history of our country, there's always been one branch that's been more powerful than others. For example, in war times, the executive branch becomes much more powerful. So those things have happened. But I don't see a quick evolution to where we are. What I have observed, because the people have to feel comfortable with how their government is moving, there will be a change. I think we are in the midst of a change. The question is, how quick? I alluded to earlier on in my remarks, not trying to be partisan, that we had an election in 2012. The rest of the country didn't do what I wanted to do, but if we're governed by laws, then we have to respect that. And finally, I'll say, with the division of powers, they made it even more difficult in the law writing part of our government, i.e. the U.S. Congress, by dividing power there. And those that make up the Senate have entirely different constituency than those of us that have the privilege to be in the House. Why? Because they have full states. I can tell you that the senators in California have a different outlook because that state is so large. There's 53 congressmen in that state. And I would say that the senators in Wyoming, where there's only one representative, they probably think lockstep. But nevertheless, when you pass a law, any law, it has to be precisely the same out of both bodies. And after the election of 2010 and 2012, we still have a divided government. While yes, the American people re-elected President Obama, they also re-elected a Republican House. So we control 1/2 of 1/3 of the Congress. You cannot pass anything with 1/2 of 1/3. All you can do is try to have a debate, largely, and I'm hoping to enter into that debate here on the policies that are facing our country. Because one thing is for certain, even during the Civil War, this was not breached. We will have elections. We'll have elections in 2014. We'll have a presidential election in 2016. And if the will of the American people are to change their direction, they will change it. But thank God for those that are out there talking about these issues, because American people need to know more about these issues. Now, I don't know if I answered your specific question, but if your specific question is, do I see a schism in the party? No, I don't see a schism. What I see is a robust discussion as to how we should be moving. And by the way, I shouldn't say this about the other party because I'm not a member of the other party, but if you want to see divisions in politics, look at the other party. I think sometimes they have more problems than we have. Mike is telling me that this is the end. So good. Well, listen, thank you all very much for having me. I appreciate it.